last discussion before drinks. So we'll try to keep this entertaining and exciting as well. So I've had the luxury of getting to know Secretary Esper for the better part of the last year.
I'm not sure it's a luxury, Stephen.
Yeah,
so.
well, it's only if I'm asking the questions, I guess. For the last year and a half, as part of the aforementioned Atlantic Council Commission on Defense Innovation Adoption. And it's been interesting and I think very relevant to this discussion here, because the discussion at the commission that we've been running and recently released our interim report has had a number of commissioners, and indeed our two co-chairs, Secretary Esper and Secretary of the Air Force, Deborah Lee James, are stakeholders who actually have what the term I've been using is ground combat in this space. And what I mean by that is these are not just very senior government executives that served in the Pentagon or even served in industry, but these are individuals that have deep experience now, and maybe this might not have even been the case 3 or 4 years ago, in venture capital and in high technology. In fact, Secretary Esper is involved with Red Cell Partners, as well as, I believe, the chairman of Epirus, right? So, unless that's changed since we spoke.
Still on the board.
Yeah, it's a tough macro environment, but I don't think it's that tough. So I think we're really excited in the commission as part of this discussion here too to share perspectives that I dare I say are informed by reality as well. And so I think with that out of the way, let's get to it. Secretary Esper, in addition to the work you're doing in high technology and the commission since leaving office, you had experience with industry associations, in industry, on Capitol Hill, with think tanks, and of course in the United States Army. One of your main achievements in office as Secretary of the Army was the creation of Army Futures Command. What did the creation of AFC, as it's called, kind of teach you about fostering innovation in DoD? A lot of people here are interested in autonomy and AI, of course, but also how the heck do we actually move anything in and by, with, and through the Pentagon?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I'm going to rewind the clock a little bit. As you noted, I had been, I'd worked in Congress for a number of years and then Defense Association, so I had a good feel for how acquisition, RDT&E, all that stuff works from that perspective. And then I went to Raytheon, where I worked there for a number of years and saw it from that side. And by the time I became Secretary of the Army in 2017, I had a pretty good feel for what the various levers were on all sides of the aisle, what the obstacles were, what the challenges were, and how to drive the right incentives and disincentives in some case to get things done. And so when I came into the Army, there were a number of things we needed to do. For example, if you're on the industry side of things, you want predictability. And the Army was infamous for changing its priorities every year. So what we decided was we would have 6 priorities and we would stick with them. And I'm proud to say, 6 years later, those priorities really haven't changed, which was big. And people don't understand those small things have a great deal of importance for the industry side of the house. We also knew, that acquisition is too slow, too clunky, too risk averse, so forth and so on. We can talk on end about the Valley of Death and everything else. And so what we tried to do was break the paradigm. The Army hadn't been really modernized since the Reagan era when the Big 5 weapon systems came out. And they were still doing a job at reaching the end of their lives in many ways. We knew we needed a renaissance, and we couldn't modernize the Army unless we did things differently. And that was where Army Futures Command came about. And further, we knew that in addition to working to the primes, we had to work with the entrepreneurs, the innovators out there. And so that kind of drove what does Futures Command look like and where does it go. And eventually we chose Austin, Texas, because it was a great hub for innovation. And then we did a number of other things to kind of break the cultural log jams and process log jams, cross-functional teams. We did stuff like that. But here we are today, 6 years later, the Army, out of our original 32 modernization priorities, the Army's going to deliver in one way, shape, or form 24 of them in this year, which is pretty big change, sea change. So I'm really happy about that. But I will tell you, and we can talk about this, it wasn't until I left government in November 2020, a little rather abruptly.
Should we check Twitter in case there's been a change?
No Twitter,
okay.
Nothing like that. In November 2020, as I figured out what am I going to do next, I figured how do I pull those years of experience and insight, and I like to disrupt. pull that together. And eventually, through talking to a lot of people, I eventually ended up in the VC side. And so I'm partner and a board member of Red Cell, which works in both the healthcare and defense space. And I've seen this through a number of startups we have. I'm also in the private equity space, but through the startups we see, I'm now seeing it from the other end, the challenges that innovators face. And one of Red Cell's features or attributes, if you will, is we have an AI bias. We come to all of our projects looking for areas in which we can leverage the AI talent we have inherent to the people we have in the team. So it's really interesting for me to see the entire ecosystem, or at least most of it. I haven't seen the capital side of it as much yet, but it's really fascinating, and not enough people know. I certainly didn't know, if you wind back the clock 10 years ago, the importance of innovators, entrepreneurs, venture capital, all those things that really drive innovation. And the bottom line is, and takes from what Stephen said about the Atlantic Council Commission, most people agree, certainly it's true factually, the United States does not have an innovation problem. We do not. We have $60 trillion in capital. We have the most innovative people in the world. They come to this country for the laws and rules and regulations and the mindsets to drive innovation. The problem we have at DoD is an inability to adopt it, to recognize it, identify it, and adopt it quickly. And that's the biggest thing we've tried to break down through the Atlantic Council, and one of the things that I continue to work on in my roles, and in various ways that I try and help all the different players in that ecosystem.
So as part of the commission, one of the things that you and Secretary James really pushed hard on was making sure that the recommendations were clear, actionable, of course, but I think also minimize the creation of new bureaucracy. So in offering good ideas or recommendations, the solution wasn't we need to fix DoD's culture problem or fix the FAR or create a new organization to fix all the other organizations that aren't reporting or functioning very well. Meanwhile, we have China, I think when we last spoke, there was a U.S. and Chinese carrier battle group circling each other outside Taiwan. Russia is obviously very, very active, probably far more than their military thought they would be at the moment in Ukraine. So I guess the following question is, of the recommendations that we put forward, those 10, are there ones that you view, maybe from a DoD or a congressional perspective, you've served in senior roles in both, that appear more actionable or more obvious, or are there ones where, in your heart of hearts, you're like, you know what, really good idea, it needs to get done, but it might be harder to implement?
Yeah, I mean, first things first, everybody comes to these commissions and the experts with, they have their ideas, and some of them are, the great ideas, and we cast aside dozens of great ideas. Some of the things I worked on for many years, export controls, ITAR change, so forth and so on, and try to really focus on the things that were most important, that were achievable, measurable, reasonable, so forth and so on, what we call the SMART things. And that was what we focused on. And so as I think about, and by the way, when I became Secretary of the Army, I went through this process. I'd actually gone through it before in the past. I said, what are the authorities we need in order to really modernize the military? And come to find it, DoD has the authorities it needs. We just don't use them all. We don't fully use the OTAs and stuff like that. So I began as Secretary of the Army and then carried forward as Secretary of Defense, tracking our quarterly rates by which we were using mid-tier acquisition authority and OTAs and stuff like that. I want to see the change, to drive the change. And then I was also looking at how do we move toward more firm fixed price contracts and away from other things. So we're trying to look at really metrics that drive the change, because if you don't, then your bureaucracy just slides by. So you got to stay on top of them. So how do you look at those metrics to do that? And so the biggest obstacle was the bureaucracy in terms of willingness to move quickly. And again, that kind of drove a lot of the changes with Futures Command and cross-functional teams. And as I became Secretary of Defense, I began that process as well. But of course, a lot of things eventually get to your desk. But if I were to go back, if I were to look now at your question about what were the most important things, look, I think some of the basics of allowing program officers to bundle, first of all, to get rid of a lot of budget lines. It's just unnecessary to be tracking programs at the $5 million level, $8 million level. It's silly. And then I think the bundling, if you will, allowing PEOs, giving them authority from Congress to use a capabilities bundle, if you will. So if you're in charge of air defense for the Army, I'll go with something I reasonably know, you won't have separate lines for Stinger and for NASAM and for Patriot and for you name it. Just be air defense. And if you want to move money around within that based on the needs, or if a new technology develops, like I'm on the board of Esper, which is a counter-drone company, and it's tremendous high-power microwaves uses AI to knock down swarms of drones. And we have a contract, it's fine, but took us 2 years, talk about a valley of death to get that first contract. But if you didn't have to follow those rules, if you had a capabilities-based portfolio, you could move money quickly to areas where you need it. And I think nobody would disagree that we need counter-drone technology these days. So that's one. Number two, I would remove the limits on private capital, venture capital, so forth and so on, for firms who are eligible for SBIR loans and things like that. I think we should change the reprogramming thresholds. They've never been updated for inflation over 50 years now. In fact, they've been decreased. And so it's just ridiculous to say, for me as a Secretary of Defense, that I don't have the authority to move more than 2% of my money around. I mean, think about it. If you did that in corporate America, you grind to a halt. You've got to give leaders the flexibility to do what they need to do. And if they don't do it well, then hold them accountable. So I would go, I think we talk about going back up to the 6% level. I would say even higher. There's so much more we could do if you give people the flexibility and then hold them accountable for the decisions we make. So I think those are the big three. We had recommended early on that to make the head of DIU a direct report to DepSecDef. It's been done. It was done already just as we released our report. So you could see there's 4 or 5 things right there that I could call out. There are a few others. Frank Kendall just put forward the idea of, he called it a $300 million discretionary fund. I don't know if we proposed the same thing, but it's always been a favorite of mine, is to give the service secretaries and the Secretary of Defense discretionary fund. The naysayers will call it a slush fund, but a discretionary fund to move quickly on new technologies that emerge. Because I like to say I could come up with a gee-whiz device today that would solve all of our problems when it comes AI, since this is an AI crowd, or an autonomy, if you will. But yet, even if I took it to the entire chain of command and convinced them today, it wouldn't find its way into the budget to be proposed until a year from now, and wouldn't be funded by Congress until at least 6, 7, 8 months, 10 months afterward. So you lose 2 years. So those are some of the big problems, is how do you accelerate those things? And I think a discretionary fund, as Frank Kendall has recommended, it makes sense to me.
So it's interesting. One of the most read articles that I published in recent years was one with one of our previous co-authors on the commission, Eric Lofgren, who left us to go implement all of our join Senate Armed Services to handle acquisition. So we're very excited about that. In the article we wrote, I believe in Defense One a couple years ago, the premise of the article, which people could not get enough of, used basic addition and subtraction to map out, you have a national security strategy. Let's back up the NSS and say, once you make a decision for the strategy, let's figure out how long it will take for your good ideas to actually be implemented. And it turned out we wrote this, I think in 2021, right after President Biden was elected, and it turned out that when all those good ideas would be implemented to actually address the proposed NSS, which actually didn't come out for almost another year, the soonest they would be implemented was in the middle of the presidential election cycle in 2023. And it really opened my eyes to the velocity, but also the structure and pacing of how you implement some of these changes. So to that end, we have a number of bridge funds, slush funds. We have the much talked about Office of Strategic Capital. They'll be here with me tomorrow to talk about what they're doing. Would love to get your opinion as an investor. So I invest in a number of companies, a number of drone companies, so maybe we have a portfolio with drone and counter-drone together. And the concern with a lot of the companies, even around autonomy, because autonomous technology goes in autonomous solutions, many of which are hardware. So one thing we've been wrestling with is how could you take something like a slush fund that helps you get through the RDT&E Valley of Death? People talk about valleys of death, and it appears there's a number of valleys of death. So how could you potentially use that as well as something like the Office of Strategic Capital that then also help companies, especially in hardware, get over that other valley of death, which is the procurement and production valley of death. Any thoughts there?
Yeah, first on the Office of Strategic Capital, it sounds like a good idea. We've had discussions at Atlantic Council with them. They've been very good in terms of participating in our sessions. Frankly, I fully don't understand how they're going to play. I think maybe they're going to backstop private capital, but it's just unclear to me how they're going to do that. Let me say this much. I don't think we have a capital problem in the United States. I don't think, it's hard to raise these days, but that's a separate issue. But I don't think there's a lack of money out there. I think what there's a lack of is a lack of signaling, right, from DOD to investors, to companies, but to investors to say, we really like this product. We need to see more, but we really want to pursue it. And that's what I'd like to figure out, is how to do better signaling. I mean, clearly the best signal one can give is a contract, right? One of the first things when we look at a company is, we're looking at the tech, the leadership, the total addressable market. But then I want to know, do you have any revenue coming in, right? Has anybody bought into you, and are you delivering on it? And so in my view, the best signal was a contract. But short of that, because again, you don't get that contract through DOD for the most part until you exit the valley of death. Are there easier ways to signal that? Now maybe Office of Strategic Capital is going to do that, but then the Office of Strategic Capital needs to know that DOD is serious about a technology. Otherwise, they're throwing money around in the dark as well, or they're going to somehow have to do due diligence just like the VCs do. So it's really unclear to me how that's going to work. So hopefully tomorrow you guys can ask all the smart questions, and they need to help think their way through it as well. But now I forgot the second part of your question.
I think you already answered it. Is essentially, what is the role of capital either in supporting the crossing of an RDT&E valley of death or a procurement valley of death? And I think you're hitting on a lot of those key issues.
Yeah, I think part of that, by the way, the relationship between those two is one of our really smart persons who was an author, Pete Modigliani, kind of point out the fact that the transition rates between RDT&E and production are much lower than they used to be. I don't know how to measure that. I don't know that if that's because we're putting more into RDT&E and being less successful, and that's fine. Or maybe the fact is the acquisition side isn't picking up enough of the investments made into the innovators through the RDT. I don't know. We have to. That needs to be examined more closely. Why more things aren't transitioning from RDT&E into that. So that would be an important thing to understand better.
So drilling in a little bit more, obviously we're at an event focused on AI and autonomy. Do you see, maybe from your time as Secretary of the Army, standing up AFC or as SecDef, areas that are more obvious where AI and autonomous solutions could be implemented? Or are there other areas where, in your deliberations with senior stakeholders in the building, where it was just like too tall of an order? A class that kind of seems like a good idea until you scratch the surface. And
no, look, it's a great idea. I've said since when I entered office that AI to me was the most important technology. Of all the 12 or 13 that we identified, AI was the most important. Because we could talk about the great inventions of history. Let's just, in more modern times, the light bulb, the computer, so forth and so on. But all those are driven by electricity, right? So AI, in many ways, we used to analogize it. AI is the electricity that will really drive these future technologies in any number of areas. And so in my mind, it's a game changer. It will change the character of warfare, not the nature, but the character. And my view was whoever gets there first will dominate for many, many years, which is why it's critical that we get there before the Chinese. So I think AI is critical. You combine that with robotics, you start looking at autonomy. And I mean, look at what we did in the late 90s with drones, right, with attack drones, semi-autonomous systems. First of all, resisted by the military at first, but we've, since that time now, 25 years, how far we've come. We are not moving quick enough in the naval and Marine and Army domains to do more, to leverage more AI and autonomy. I was just talking to the gentleman who was in the Navy who did task force.
Captain Bresser.
Yeah, great job, tremendous idea, and he did it very quickly, very innovative. But you have to kind of, you not only have to lead the horse to the water, you got to make the horse drink it. You got to push the horse over, roll it around in the creek a little bit until it understands the importance of this. And I'm talking, most often people think about AI in the warfighting battlefield function, right? There are multiple battlefield functions. People think about AI there. But Task Force 59 is about sensing and monitoring and doing things like that, right? In the Army, we talked a lot about AI to do better predictive and other types of maintenance. You can anticipate when your Black Hawk rotor is going to fail, and you could order the part, and you could do better just-in-time logistics. I think it can be used far better in terms of HR. And so there are a number of things. One of the companies we founded at Red Cell, it's called DEFCON, we have a contract with the Air Force where we're using AI to help them train, simulate, and do better planning when it comes to air mobility. So think about how you can do that now. You can move away from wet boards with your dry erase markers and really program it in and anticipate, because we know the fixed number of airfields, we know aircraft, but you can really do a lot of contingency planning, whether it's enemy actions, bad weather, you name it, but in ways that we really think is going to be a leap ahead for the Air Force, and that's in planning. Another big area is logistics. Again, all these are fields where I think AI can really be a game changer and accelerate the speed of decision making, make it more precise, and give commanders, the military, more optionality. And so those are just three things that I think that are out there. So the imagination is the limit in terms of what we can do here, and that's why we got a lot of smart people out here. I know we talked earlier, or previous to this, about the Army. Spent some time with the Army trying to figure out how we do optionally manned fighting vehicles, which I actually think is the most difficult autonomous problem to have out there, and we could talk about that. But I think it's a bright future.
Well, actually, let's talk a little bit more about that. What, from your experience with like OMFE, or optionally manned fighting vehicle, in case you didn't pick that up earlier, what were some of the challenges, like either bureaucratic or technical challenges, that you and your team ran into with programs like that?
Well, the bureaucracy, it exists. It pervades everything, right? So I think, the interesting thing with ground combat vehicles, anybody here working ground combat vehicles? No? Oh, okay, 3 guys. So, jump up if I get something wrong. Here's why I think it's the most difficult. It's one thing to send an autonomous aircraft into the air and fly, right? A little bit more challenging in some ways with the sea, but with a ground combat vehicle, you have to do a number of functions, right, that are very hard. You have to, first of all, you have to navigate. Then you have to navigate terrain, right? Is that thing in front of me a bush or a boulder, right? And then you have to maneuver, which means you have to have some sense of tactically how to deploy alongside blue forces. So now you're taking on 3 challenging problems. Am I too close, too far away, too far, so forth and so on. And then you have to do it against enemy forces, which all these things are intuitive to a platoon leader, a platoon sergeant. You want to stay below the ridge line, you want to get in the tree line, things like that. But you have to teach the system, I mean, you guys tell me, right, to use at least these 4 functions together. And it's really challenging. And I think if we can master that, it would be incredible. Now, there are things we can do now. You can do it semi-autonomously. You can do leader-follower. We're doing some of that in logistics. I think the easiest thing that I was hoping to field deployed during my time as Secretary of the Army is a simple convoy. I can't tell you how many hundreds of soldiers we lost during the Iraq War, running the supply route from Kuwait City to Baghdad, right, due to IEDs and enemy attacks. It's because, you had a dozen trucks, and every truck had 2 or 3 soldiers in the cab. And it was easy to kind of disrupt them. They weren't well defended. But imagine, just do a leader-follower. Imagine if the lead truck was the only truck that had people in it, and the next 11 were autonomously following. Think about the lives saved. And then beyond that, think about the soldiers, the uniforms, the people you could put in other areas, right? Because we have a recruiting problem in the United States Army. So this is where I think AI can really free up bodies, if you will, to put into other areas that are more manpower intensive. So this is where I say the sooner we master this, and this is going back now 6 years. When I was Secretary of the Army, we were talking about this. The sooner we can master this and get ahead of it, I think there's going to be great dividends that are paid for the military in ways we can't really imagine right now. Any thoughts back there from you 3 guys? Ground? No? You're just going to, okay. He gave me a thumbs up.
Yeah, you can say who.
2 thumbs up.
So this is actually a great segue to a theme that I've heard some of the other panelists talk about before, and that's this topic of human capital. You previously said, or emphasized the importance of DoD's proximity to academia as a way of attracting talented innovators, certainly to serve in the armed forces, but also to enable the technologies that we all say we want. So from your perspective, how do you see academia's role? AFC had a strong role in university academic engagement strategy. How do you see academia's role in evolving the state-of-the-art with technology like autonomous systems?
Yeah, I think it's part of the ecosystem that sometimes is, sometimes isn't well incorporated. I spent a lot of time at West Point. A week ago, I was at Purdue, and talking to them. I hosted a ROTC ceremony and spent some time at the Kroc Institute. And then just Monday, I was at the University of Alabama, Huntsville, right down in Huntsville, Redstone Arsenal. Boy, I'll tell you, all those places are doing tremendous things with technology, and they're, in Huntsville, they have the counter drone or the drone center of excellence. They're leading in hypersonics. They're doing a lot of other work, and so what you have these young, fertile, innovative young minds in the students that are unencumbered by conventional wisdom that we all carry with us. The older you get, the more boundaried you become in some ways. They don't have any of those constraints about what's possible or what's not impossible. And so they're really thinking outside the box. And what I got asked the same question, so maybe you were talking to him, Stephen, by the president of the institution, Chuck Carr. And what my response about academia was was to make sure you're very close to DoD, and in the case of Huntsville, DoD, NASA, so forth, and so forth and so on. Same thing with Purdue. But the one thing that they seem to be missing is there's not much venture around. So even if they come up with a good idea, it may not get a contract or may not get any traction with their DoD counterparts in the town. But if there was more venture out there that could tap into that, it might be worthwhile. So I'm personally going to try and expend some time to see how much really is in academia that ideas are coming out but just aren't getting contracted or are kind of waiting or are latent there because the ecosystem isn't fully surrounding them yet. So I just think it's a great place to be, particularly in some of these schools that are pushing hard on the tech and engineering side, and it's exciting.
So I'd like to ask the organizers if they can throw up the QR code. Please do send your questions in. We'd like to get as many of them in as possible as part of this discussion as we continue to punch through some of the questions I already have in the magazine here. Let me stay at the tactical level before zooming back out to some macro questions. So there are a number of new forms of AI. AI is a impossibly broad ontology, things like generative AI, large language models. And there's a big debate, like across the country, is do we use it or do we not, right? Do we develop it or do we not? In DoD, of course, is heavily incentivized towards risk management instead of risk adoption. So from your position now in the private sector, but also having worn numerous senior hats before, how should DoD think about the adoption of these technologies, or at a minimum, mitigating the risk of a potential downside with some of these AI technologies that could, in theory, get out of hand?
Well, I'll speak out of both sides of my mouth. On one hand, full speed ahead, right? We got to win this race, and so we have to keep going. I don't believe in pauses or anything like that, but we should do so, keeping these other things in mind. Now, I can say that from a position where, because in late 2019 or 2020, I pushed forward and signed AI set of principles for DoD that we would abide by. There were a number of 5, 6 principles. Eric Schmidt and others worked on that. I adopted it and we pushed it because I thought, look, they were good. Could they be improved? Probably, because we have 4 years of learning now. But I thought it was important to kind of set a baseline about how DoD would design, develop, implement, use AI. And I think, and I want to set a standard out there for everybody else and for our allies and partners. But that said, so on one hand, I'll say full speed ahead, knowing that we did that. But I also think that there needs to be, coming from corporate America and from others, a set of principles that will guide the responsible development and use of AI as well. And so I think, because look, while there's a lot of potential and opportunity, there are downsides. And we've seen any number of people talk about this yesterday on the Hill. They had the CEO of ChatGPT talking. He's calling for regulation, and that That may be necessary, probably is. We'll see. But I think this needs to be discussed now before we get too far down the road. And I think, everybody here in the room who's in this should be part of that discussion. But I don't think we should put the brakes on it. There is no putting the brakes on it. And I would like to see us dominate in this space and then kind of write the rules of the road, if you will, for not just us, but for the internet, for the globe, right? For everybody, international set of rules and norms that we can hold people accountable to, just like we've done with so many other things out there, whether it's weapons of mass destruction, laws of land warfare, you name it. That's where we need to go. Because the Chinese aren't going to follow those rules, the Russians aren't going to follow those rules. Without them, we can't hold them accountable. So I think we need to do both, and we need to do both quickly. And I'm glad that this is being talked about almost on a daily basis these days.
So you mentioned Eric Schmidt, and for a period of time he chaired the Defense Innovation Board.
Right.
One of our other co-authors for the commission, Whitney McNamara, previously worked at the DIB as well. From your experience, are those good use cases for the DIB? What's the best way to get traction out of it? Something like a Defense Innovation Board that's populated by a series of impressive-sounding private sector folks.
The challenge is there's a lot of boards out there, right? So you mentioned the DIB. I also had the Defense Business Board, the Defense Policy Board, so forth and so on. And you got to use them and give them access and work them. And I had given the Defense Policy Board some action items to do, and then Defense Innovation Board, Eric and his folks were driving action on their own. Of course, we got shut down for a number of months due to COVID and restrictions on getting together. But it's important to use those, and that's kind of. If I were to think about the Defense Innovation Board now, that's kind of what I would do, is put them on the task of what the Atlantic Council is working on, and that is how do we more quickly identify and adopt and then develop technologies. Again, the issue is not innovation. We have innovation. It's all, not all, most of it's coming from the commercial sector, right, from what many of you do. And so DoD can't keep up with that. But there are things we can do. I stood up the AI task force at Carnegie Mellon in 2018. Mm-hmm. And since then, and I was up there last year, it's all about how do we push AI within the Army, but we're also developing people at multiple ranks, right? Junior officers, mid-career officers, and the idea is to get them out in the field. And I think every year we're graduating a couple dozen that are going out into the units and not just advising on how to incorporate AI into current operations, but have the skills in some cases to code or recode on the spot, which is useful. So I think what we need to do is really get the DIB thinking about how do we improve innovation adoption, and then how do we continue to train, back to human capital, folks within DoD, uniforms and civilians, to first of all understand it, and then secondly to kind of keep pace with it and be able to implement it as we go.
So let's kind of shift and talk about friends and frenemies, if you will, or just plain adversaries. NATO and other multilateral or bilateral treaty partners. NATO obviously has tried to take a leadership or a fast follower role around AI and autonomy, right? So what do you see as DoD's role in shaping and supporting concepts like interoperability with our NATO partners and allies, especially with the war in Ukraine as a key focal point?
Whose responsibility, you said?
What is the U.S.'s responsibility, or DoD's responsibility, or what should it be in supporting interoperability and or ensuring that we have a strategic advantage vis-a-vis China or Russia, because we're not going to go to war, or we're not going to attempt to counter them by ourselves.
Yeah, so look, a strategic asymmetrical advantage we have over the Russians and Chinese is we have allies and partners. We have dozens of them, and they have 4 or 5. And if you want North Korea, Mali, Nicaragua, and Iran on your team, then that's their pickup team. I like our team. No, that's right. I think that's their team. Maybe some of the stands. So we are going to go to war. We need to go to war with our allies and partners. And to do that, though, they need to be interoperable with us. And so we've obviously gone out of our way in the pre-existing domains of land, sea, and air to do that. But now we're in space and cyber. And I was just down at the Space and Missile Defense Command in Huntsville, as I said, but working with Space Force. Space Force out in Colorado and Space Command are heavily involved with allies and partners. If you were to go to their command center, you'll see different uniforms there. And that's very important that we do that. And we need to do the same on cyber. We do a lot through Cyber Command. So AI is another area where we need to help bring them along, and they'll bring us along. We talked earlier about Task Force 59, and I asked, again, the gentleman out there, how did you guys do it so quickly? And it wasn't the U.S. military that did it. It was NATO. It was a NATO idea. And that was, so our allies have a lot of potential and capability as well. We need to rely on them, but we need to, we can't slow down, but we need to bring people along with us as much as possible so that we get the interoperability and the ideas and everything else of how to fight in the future.
So you've also previously stated that we're in and I want to get this right, China is engaged in the greatest intellectual property theft in human history. So it's been well covered that we're in a systemic competition with them. They've been had a decades-long campaign to acquire U.S. technology, U.S. intellectual property, to include investing in U.S. Defense technology and indeed venture-backed commercial companies. From your perspective, what do we need to be doing to attempt to counter this, the theft of the technology, but more importantly, their encroachment upon the U.S. high technology landscape?
Yeah, it is the greatest theft in human history. It's about $600 billion alone from us alone. And I don't know what it is from the European partners and others, the Japanese, Koreans. It's enormous as well. So, yes, they are stealing a lot of our IP, and not just for military reasons, but for economic reasons. We know they want to dominate a number of industries, and they're all the industries right? Telecom, aviation, so forth and so on. So I think obviously we need to tighten up our export control systems. We need to do a much better job in terms of understanding how they do what they do. A lot of it's through cyber. A lot of it's through traditional espionage. FBI Director Chris Wray says often that he opens up an espionage investigation with regard to China every 12 hours. Every 12 hours. So we continue to be raw blind, and I think this has been talked about a lot. I think there's the Trump administration began this approach, and the Biden administration is picking up it as well. I think there's going to be, with regard to China, because of the integration of our economies, there will be a number of things happen. I think there's going to be a strategic decoupling at the top tier of technologies. That's happening now, right? Think semiconductors. Mm-hmm. And then I think there's going to be a de-risking in the next tier. In other words, we may trade with them, we may produce some of these things in China, but we're not going to rely on them alone, right? We're going to diversify in other areas, or maybe we'll reshore. And then everything else, I think, we'll sort that out. But I think those will be two new areas that we have to think about, or else we will continue to deliver them the means to beat us militarily, to beat us economically, and to help them achieve their goals, whereas we want to achieve our goals. And look, it's not our goals. The Western goals are not just about the United States having the largest economy in the world, and so forth and so on. But it's preserving the international rules and norms as we know it. It's about preserving Western democracy and our values. And that's what we don't want to lose. And technology is going to be the forefront of that. And on the forefront of that technology will be AI, because of, again, how comprehensive and how critical it is to everything we will be doing in the future. I don't doubt that one bit. Again, if we can develop it quickly, smartly, and responsibly, then I think we'll be in good shape.
So along those lines, we have a number of regional allies in East Asia. East Asia the Pacific is impossibly vast, astonishingly vast. So one of my previous bosses, Secretary Gates, had a quote that went something like, you might remember this, like no amount of technology can replace the fact that you need a carrier battle group in the Strait of Hormuz and the Strait of Malacca at the same time. So with that in mind, relying on our partners, and indeed speaking of frenemies, countries like India, any thoughts on what we should be doing with countries like Australia and Japan? And then also, is there a better way to leverage India or work with them than what we have currently been doing?
Yeah, of all examples, you had to talk aircraft carriers because, as you know, I put forward a battle force plan in 2020 that I thought we should de-emphasize, not get rid of, but de-emphasize these big deck $20 billion carriers, particularly in places where they're vulnerable, such as the Strait of Hormuz. anyways, you think about how you allocate your dollars within your military. I would argue it did at the time that the U.S. Navy was far better allocating some of those dollars to submarines and things like that. And we could talk AI in that regard too. And really importantly, the battle force, and I know I'm a little bit off topic, but you'll understand why here. The battle force plan that we put forward in October 2020 called for distributed lethality, more smaller ships, fewer big deck ships, more submarines, but importantly, building a fleet by the year 2045, I'm sorry, of over 150 unmanned vessels. And we're probably nowhere near that. And so, and we could do that right now. We've been testing unmanned vessels, both surface and subsurface, for a few years now. Why we aren't producing them en masse to do a number of things. And we won't get it right the first time. You asked this earlier. The version 1.0 will be okay. Version 2.0 will be a little bit better. 3.0 will be good. And so, but we need to get on that path and start deploying these ships and using them. That's why I think Task Force 59 was great. I'd be putting Task Force 59s in the South China Sea right now if I had. And so, but that's kind of where we were thinking. But again, to do autonomy, you need to have robust AI and other things to do that. So to me, that's where the future needs to go and it needs to be. And I forgot the second part of your question.
Oh, is there a better way to leverage India than what we've currently been doing? Is that even possible?
India?
Yeah.
In my memoir, I wrote that if China is the greatest strategic adversary of the 21st century, and I believe they are, the greatest strategic partner that we need to develop, that we need to grow closer to, is India, right? Now the largest population in the world. They're on the ascent. China is declining. And they got a rich talent base. It's another democracy. They get some challenges politically, but set that aside. But I think that there's a lot to tap into. They got great geography when it comes to China. There's no love lost between Beijing and Delhi. And so I think, yes, I think we need to continue to work with them. That's why I was really glad to, work a lot on the Quad, develop military relationships between our two countries. That really needs to develop. I think that's another key relationship going forward that we have to manage really well. And the good news is I've been working on India since at least the Bush administration. Bush began, maybe Clinton before him, but certainly Bush began outreach to the Indians. And then I was glad to see the Obama administration picked it up. And then the Trump administration, Mike Pompeo and I spent a lot of time with India. And now this administration too. So there's been good bipartisan consensus on the importance of building a relationship with India. So that's important.
And the book, Sacred Oath, right?
Right.
On sale at Amazon. Sorry, I do that so you don't have to.
Okay.
So as part of our commission, one of the things I thought that was notable was that there was bipartisan with a number of all the commissioners who all still had the term I use is they all still had juice. They still had a lot of political capital, still highly engaged in D.C. In circles that matter and have throw weight on these issues that we're talking about. Probably more importantly, there's unanimity, right, that you, to my detriment, insisted on. We insisted on occurring, and we got there, right? There was no dissenting comments on the commission. Part of that was this sentiment that, as part of our launch, I think was very clear and publicly stated, which is that the event horizon for countering and dealing with China is here, right? It's not in 2035, it's not in 2028. We need to be doing something about this right now. You want to expand more on that and what you view as kind of the potential on-ramps to conflict, or more importantly, off-ramps to conflict with China, given that, again, the sentiment from the commission was that we need to be acting urgently and now.
Yeah, so let me say up front, I don't think war between the United States and China is imminent, and I also don't think it is inevitable. That said, I wrote in my memoir as well that I think Northeast Asia is the greatest strategic flashpoint in the world, Taiwan specifically, but not just because of, you would have China and the United States involved. You would have the world's largest economies involved. So think about the economic disruption if you had the world's three largest economies would be involved in this fight, right? The United States, China, and Japan in that order. And then, of course, there are other regional economies that are also big players, particularly in technology, right? So Korea, for example. You have 4 nuclear weapon states: United States, North Korea has nuclear weapons, Russia, China. We already talked about the tech piece of it. Those are very tech-heavy countries. You talk about Korea, Japan, China, United States, Taiwan with TSMC. Interesting, I saw where Warren Buffett just disinvested, if you will, from TSMC. It's curious. So anyways, it's the greatest strategic flashpoint with the worst consequences for anything. So, but I don't think war is inevitable, but we have to manage it very carefully. Now, if you believe, as I do, that the key to us maintaining our dominance, superiority, and war fighting, et cetera, and then as a means to deter China, and modernization means really leveraging advanced tech, I think we're behind. People talk about different time frames and windows. We do know that Xi Jinping has told the PLA, be prepared to seize Taiwan by 2027. Of course, that's the 100th anniversary of the PLA, and he's putting a mark on the wall for them. So I don't read too much into that. But let's just use that for a moment, because I brought this up at the Atlantic Council Commission. If you believe 2027 is the year we have to be prepared, and if you believe that leveraging the best tech we have, right, beginning with AI, but also directed energy, robotics, quantum, 5G, I mean, kind of go down the list. If you believe that is the key, then we're already behind. We're already behind. Why? Because even if we could, and many of you are probably involved in some of these technologies, if we could adopt them today, there's only 2 budget cycles left before 2027, right? So if you came up with the idea today, it wouldn't find its way into the budget until the 25 budget, right? Which would be submitted to the Hill next February, but it wouldn't be funded until December of 2024, and the money wouldn't start flowing until 2026. I'm maybe messing my lines up. And then you have one more budget cycle, and then you're in the year 2027. And that's not even accounting for the fact that you have to prototype it, and then you have to sign the contracts, and then you have to begin low rate initial production, so forth and so on. We're behind. Bottom line is we're behind. If 2027 is your timeline. If you say your timeline is now 2035, which, by the way, is another date that Xi Jinping put out by which he wanted to have a modern military, then okay, we now have 7 budget cycles. But the key is when you combine the valley of death, the slowness of the budgeting, so forth and so on, the lack of flexibility we've given our commanders, with the time it takes not to innovate now, but to produce the items. Again, I told you I'm on the board of Esper, which is a counter-drone company, and we have a contract. But we're still in the prototyping phase. We'd have to build out a factory, right? You all know what it takes to hire people. You have to acquire plant and capital. You have to get qualified. All these things take months, if not years, to do. So you got to think about those timelines that way. That's why, in many ways, the conflict with Ukraine has exposed the weaknesses of the just-in-time defense base that we have and have had for many years. And I'm glad to see DOD is moving out to fix that. Not moving quick enough, but moving out to fix it. So these same things apply. If you think it's slow expanding existing production lines, think how much slower it is creating non-existent production lines. And that's what we face with. So that's why I say we're behind. Because at the end of the day, you can have the best AI, the best directed energy, so forth and so on, but you got to get it into every battalion, onto every ship, into every squadron, so forth and so on. And we're not at that point yet. And that's not even talking about selling it to allies and partners.
Well, I was very anxious. I thought all of you were either asleep or tweeting under the assumption that myself and definitely not Secretary Esper would be checking our Twitter feeds. But I just had a whole bunch of questions populate. So there's one I really like. It says, how can the department leadership help normalize failure so that the department can fail fast and fail forward? How can the department leadership help normalize failure so that the department can fail fast and fail forward?
Yeah, look, in my mind, there may be other ways. There's one way I know, and that is you have to get personally involved. That's why I took on the whole night court process as Secretary of the Army, and we ended up canceling or reducing it like 186 programs, $40–50 billion worth of budget.
And can you share more about what Night Court is for the uninitiated?
Anybody heard of Night Court before? No? Okay, a few hands. So anyways, when I took over in 2017, I knew we had to, I told you before, I knew we had to modernize the Army. And when I sat down with our 6 priorities, I mentioned the 6 priorities before, long-range precision fires, which has proven to be true, air defense, so forth and so on. The programmers, the budgeteers said, sir, this is your budget. You only have this much money. It was like, I don't know, $500 million. And I said, what do you mean? I got a $180 billion budget. Where's the other $185 billion? And so it's all tied up in the bureaucracy here and there. And I just said, forget it. Look, I want bring in we had like 500 some programs. You're going to bring in every single program, and we're going to start going through them. And we're going to either cancel them, or we're going to either kill them or reduce them. And we're going to replace that list with the top 32 programs we had, and we'll free up the budgets. And we went through, myself, General Milley joined us, Jim McConville, Ryan McCarthy. Eventually, we went through all 500 some programs. It took us 60, 70 hours and ended up killing or reducing about 186 programs, about 40 or $50 billion. And so that we could free up that money to invest. And when you invest, you do it not just for the current the fiscal year that you're preparing the budget for, but you have to track it through the FIDEP. So it's a much bigger task. But we ended up freeing up all that money and actually got congressional support, which is a good thing. And that's kind of why these 24 programs that will be fielded in one way, shape, or form are where they are today, because we allocated the money. I knew that everybody knows DOD goes in cycles, and we were in an upcycle, right? So nobody wants to fix their roof when it's sunny out. They want to wait until it's raining. And my view is fix it while it's sunny, because the rain's coming, and the rain is here. So anyways, that's what we did. We did the Night Court thing. And so fast forward, I began that process as SecDef, and then a number of things took over. But to me, the leadership has to get involved. Civilian and leadership has to get personally involved and kind of carry the burden of making cuts and reductions and changes and placing big bets on what they would do. I got to tell you, I've said to different audiences, if I were to go back into the job again, I'm still in my 50s. If I were to go back in the job again, I would probably hold a quarterly type of Shark Tank. And I would kind of call young firms in if we thought they had potential. They were kind of gone through maybe an A round or something like that, Series A round, where some vetting had already happened. But I would kind of do it and bring the top leadership in and see this tech and then make the tough calls and make the bets and be willing not to get it 100% right. You got to be willing to fail. You got to be willing to get some of them wrong in order to do that. We all like to say about, you all know Babe Ruth was the greatest home run hitter of all time, right? He was also a strikeout king. Why? Because he swung a lot, but he hit a lot of home runs too. So we have to kind of adopt that type of approach when it comes to investing in these technologies. And we used to say in the Army when we were standing up Futures Command, we want to fail fast. So if something's not making it, you shoot it and you move on, and you put that money somewhere else, and you bring up the next great idea that's out there, consistent with whatever your priorities are, and keep moving, and you got to work with Congress on that. You got to work with all the right players, but that is the key. It has to be that personal leadership.
If you do that Night Court or Shark Tank example again, you should call it a double tap, just so people get the picture on what's going to happen. This is another good question. I think we'll start to land the plane here. So the proliferation of unmanned systems from adversary countries, adversarial nations, I assume this is code for technologies like DJI and Autel out of China, have made tangible battlefield effects. What's the balance between a focus on developing complex technical solutions, right, like an OMFE and things like that, carriers, playing to my audience here, and cheaper low-cost solutions that can be employed en masse? So again, what's the balance between complex technical solutions and kind of low-cost, commercially available products?
I think it depends on the strategic environment, first of all. I think where we are today because most of the technology, or at least certainly a majority, is coming from the commercial side, we should go that route. I think in an era of tight budgets, and then not by extension, but we also are not only facing tight budgets and tightening budgets, but we also have manpower issues that are a whole separate, kettle of fish here. But it's manpower issues as well. So I think the key is, for the Navy, our argument was distributed lethality, given what the Chinese were building and pursuing. I think in today's world, you're not going to do away with conventional systems, whether they are carriers or battle tanks or so forth and so on. But you can look at changing how much you put towards those things as compared towards drones and drone swarms. The Ukrainians are doing incredible things with drones. And I just read a story today where they're $40 commercial drones, they're attaching a small explosive, and they're destroying multi-million-dollar tanks. Well, at least our tanks are multi-million dollars. The Russian tanks, who knows what they're worth. But they're destroying tanks, and that was a concern of ours from DoD perspective, that it's another asymmetric threat, much like IEDs were during the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. So I think we need to kind of balance that out. To do that, you also have to think about organizational changes, training changes, so forth and so on, to come up with those technologies. But in today's world, and this was kind of the thinking as we came up with our conceptual framework looking into the future of warfare that eventually drove multi-domain operations, the underlying assumption was that you were going to be fighting on a battlefield, that you were under constant surveillance, persistent surveillance, where the enemy knew where you were and could strike you quickly and on short notice. And so that calls for distribution of forces and distribution of lethality, which, if you think about, that is what the Ukrainians did in the early days and continue to do now, when everybody was running around carrying a javelin or a Stinger or both, and killing tanks and knocking aircraft out of the air. I mean, look, the Ukrainians have, I wouldn't say crippled, but they've pretty much shut down the Air Force of maybe the third largest Air Force in the world, Russia. Right. United States, China, then Russia. So the Russian Air Force isn't flying because of, initially, troops with Stingers. They also had some S-300 systems. But you can see what you can do with distributed lethality. So I think the more you can distribute, and drone technology is one of those, anything handheld, things like those will be critical on the battlefield. And again, it gets back to AI and autonomy. This is what we were trying to do through the Army AI Task Force. If you can also have people trained who know the military operations, but can code and recode at the forward edge of the battle area, or at least in the theater, then that gives you an advantage of adapting quickly to what the enemy is doing, and then adjusting your systems.
So last question, and then we'll wrap up, and I'll tee up the most hated man in D.C., John Mark Wilson, because he's standing between you and a killer reception. So we've touched on this a little bit before, but I really like this question as a closing kind of remark. In order for the private sector to better invest in technologies relevant to defense, dual use or otherwise, it needs to understand DoD's needs. We talked about this before.
You understand what?
DoD's needs,
right?
Requirements. What more does DoD need to do, or should it do, to signal its priorities to industry? What should the Pentagon be doing to signal its priorities, that consistent demand signal to industry, whether that be the defense industrial base, they play a role in this, or what we're now calling the national security innovation base?
Yeah, I think, first of all, DoD has a set of requirements, right? But those you don't necessarily know what you need until you have it, and then you need it, right? Nobody knew they needed an iPhone until Steve Jobs invented them, or at least did what he did. So what you occasionally find is, while DoD has a fairly good knowledge of what it needs, there are things out there that people are creating that, if you take it to DoD, as people would bring stuff to me, I used to have dinners every week with technologists and technology companies. They'd bring you stuff and you're like, wow, I never thought about that. And they would, just different ways to use different things or new things. So I think part of it is making sure that DoD talks frequently and comprehensively with industry about what they're looking for, what they need, what they know they need. There's like the Rumsfeldian known needs and unknown needs type of thing. And I know that SOCOM and the folks down in Tampa do this really well. I was down there a couple months ago. They have a tremendous system set up where they're talking all the time. They're holding special events and occasions. I was told a story where the military divers, if you will, held some type of event where they invited everybody to a pool, bring your stuff, bring your super duper fins and regulators and whatever. And they just kind of had a workshop with folks to see what was out there, what people were developing. So I think doing more of those types of things, expanding on what the folks down at SOCOM are doing is important, but also is keeping an open venue by which you can bring forward good ideas, whether it's a Shark Tank or not, whether it's based on a DoD need or not. There are a lot of folks out here who are veterans who are thinking up neat things that they wish they had when they were a platoon leader or a pilot or a sub-driver or whatever. And those people can have good ideas that they can bring to the DoD and say, I know you guys, this isn't in a CDD or in JSIDs or whatever, but I think you guys will like this, and I think DoD has to keep an open mind to things that are outside the box. That's why if you cut down the budget lines, if you have capability portfolios, if you have the discretionary fund that Frank Kendall's asking about, then folks in DoD can quickly throw down money to see, well, let's develop this, let's take it to the next stage, and let's see whether it really has merit, and not just merit, but is it reliable? Can it survive on the battlefield? Is it fixable? Is it producible? So forth and so on. So I think you've got to, again, two things. Talk loudly, frequently, comprehensively about how you envision future warfare and what you need so people can get inside your box and think along with you. But at the same time, be open to new ideas, even if it's not blessed by the J-ROC or been through JSIDs or in a CDD, whatever the case may be. And I think marrying those two up will take you a long way.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your patience today. As you know, we'll have a second day tomorrow. I'll be doing an exciting panel with some friends from Lex Capital and Dreesen, and also Jason Rathje from the Office of Strategic Capital, where we all get to ask him, Jason, when are you actually going to deploy said strategic capital? So looking forward to that. We're happy to give you term sheets that rip your face off on valuation or equity if you're in a startup. But in the meantime, please join me in thanking Secretary Esper and welcoming John Mark.